and the outcomes for the Indigenous community are still not where they need to be. So if you think about the term BIPOC and diversity and inclusion, I think of what's happening in the Indigenous community as a blueprint or a start, nowhere near where it needs to be, but you got to start replicating that for other groups. And again, I speak to you very clearly as a Black Canadian. Would love to see some of these outcomes change for the Black community in Canada. So without further ado, I want to again introduce you to my friends to speak about this topic. And first, I'd like to introduce you to Angela Cooke. Angela Cooke has been a colleague of mine in a different lifetime, but is now currently the Associate Deputy Minister in the province of British Columbia. At the height of the pandemic, and this is one of those power of people persons who Angela is. Come on out, Angela. I'll keep speaking to you, but come on out. Angela, in her former role as the Vice President of BC Housing, successfully navigated her organization and her operations team through the constraints and restraints of COVID-19. Angela was also required to execute provincial-based programs on behalf of not only the ministry she served, which was the Municipal Housing and Affairs, but also the Ministry of Health and for the Attorney General and for the Ministry of Children and Family Development. So Angela did a lot of work in her short time in BC, which has led her to her new role as the Associate Deputy Minister of Housing, Construction Standards, and Anti-Racism for the province of British Columbia. Congratulations and thank you, Angela. My next panelist is Dr. Barrington Walker. He's the Associate Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at Wilfrid Laurier University. Barrington is an expert on all things with respect to ED&I and the modern Canadian society. And he'll help us not only within the broader part of the panel discussion, but he'll also help us set some historical context. Because I think without knowing where we're coming from, we can't anyway build a better path forward. So thank you for being here, Barrington. Next up, we have Steph Jones. Steph Jones is the Vice President of Business Transformation. Steph is instrumental in his past role as the Vice President of Innovation in shaking up and overhauling the company's strategic direction. His goal for putting housing and housing affordability at the forefront of CMHC's efforts in a disruptive way has really put the organization on a good step forward to making change. As an ally to the BIPOC community, Steph is also the executive sponsor for CMHC's Network of Black Leaders. Yes, Network of Black Leaders. An important position that has Steph and his colleagues focus on designing better outcomes for stakeholders and staff within the CMHC. So thank you for being here. And our fourth panelist, who will join the session in progress, is a gentleman named Beckles. He's the Vice President of Social Impact at RBC. To give us some broader perspective, because sometimes we look at things and we think, okay, this is only happening in our sector, or how can we make change? There's always broader perspectives to be had, and Mark will help us understand that from a more private sector lens. But Mark, in his over 25 years of experience, he leads RBC's corporate social impact division, and he'll be joining us shortly. As I said earlier, we're coming from Toronto, and traffic at any time of the day here is a gamble. So without further ado, I'm going to have a seat and pose a question to my friend, Dr. Walker. So welcome, Dr. Walker. Thank you. Just would love to get your perspective on some of the historical context in Canada with respect to, I'd say, leaving folks behind a little bit when it comes to being an inclusive society and giving them access that they need, especially people of color within Canada.
Mm-hmm. You know what I will say, last night I was watching a pretty popular program on TV Ontario that airs at 8 o'clock, and there was a discussion about global migration, and Canada was pointed to as a kind of an exemplary society that had managed diversity in ways that a lot of countries don't manage diversity, and I think it was an important point. And I think this also there's a line in Canada going, back from today, from multiculturalism back to the Underground Railroad and some of the conversations and mythologies surrounding that. But I think that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about this multicultural society that we celebrate and all of its accomplishments, that there's a longer history that got us to this point. And even this multicultural society that we tout is not without many of the issues that you said off the top. So this is a country that was founded on the dispossession of indigenous peoples, settler colonialism. There's also a long and entrenched history of slavery in Canada.
Yes.
Racial discrimination, what scholars call Jim Crow, that was supported by law. And a plethora of cultural institutions and social practices that also created the conditions for inequality in Canada. So while it's important for us to celebrate the gains that we have made and maybe some things that we're doing better than other folks, it's also important for us not to invisibilize those long histories of exclusion and those practices of marginalization that are really an integral part of understanding modern Canadian history.
Appreciate it, and I wholeheartedly agree, and I think that's why, and I appreciate the opening salvo, Barrington, because without even this morning in our opening keynote with Winnie Horn-Miller, a lot of these sentiments came up around reconciliation. But what are we reconciling for? It's for a lot of these things that a lot of people to today aren't aware of. So I think a little bit of historical context setting for us here today will help our audience go a long way with hopefully doing some of their own research with respect to where the journey's been and where we need to get to, and why especially racialized groups are kind of putting their hands up saying, hey, we need some help here and we need some different outcomes. So Angela, I'm going to start with you because I want everybody to chime in on this question, but I'm going to start with you on a question is organizations like ours within this, the community housing sector, as I mentioned off the top, almost half of their tenants are racialized folks, right? So what are the biggest impacts by not having that pyramid, that diverse representation at the top of the pyramid, all the way down in the organizations? What are some of the devastating impacts, or could be a drastic word, I won't say devastating, but what are some of the more challenging impacts that you've seen without having that level of representation from a BIPOC lens?
Thank you, Andrew, for the question. So I think when I take a look at some of the organisations currently and taking a look at the tenant demographics, what I would say is that a lot of the leaderships in those organisations are not diverse enough and representing the tenant populations that they serve. When you are looking at your strategy and your business plans and how you're going to support those populations, if you don't have individuals that are racialized from BIPOC communities that have lived experience, how are you really validating the work that you're trying to deliver, and how are you able to successfully achieve your outputs in relation to the successes that you want to achieve? I would like to see that a lot more organisations, take a look internally at themselves and to, commit to improving the level of diversity at senior levels within social housing organisations. And that's not to say that there aren't, executives that have been in those organisations. And I think one of the things that we do need to work upon is, as you recruit these individuals, is what are you doing to ensure that they remain in the organisations and are successful and are validating the work that you're doing. They're able to resonate with community and to be your best experts in terms of what is going on the ground for your tenant populations. So for me, I would say that, moving forward, what I would like to see is that there is an absolute commitment that at all levels of your organisation that you're working towards reflecting the diversity of your tenant populations across Ontario.
Can I just ask a question to elaborate? Because as many of the audience saw, I got a little tripped up on your title, right? And I think your title is super cool. You got a lot of things going on. Can you just elaborate a little bit? Because I know it's a new position, but I don't think it's been replicated across the country yet. Before I get into Steph's response to that same question, I just wanted to get you to articulate a little bit about your role and how your role could help with some of the pieces you spoke about with respect to making that change.
Thank you. So, in my current role as the Associate Deputy Minister of Housing, Construction Standards, Multiculturalism and Anti-Racism, it's deliberately being put together as a portfolio of two distinct groups, recognising that as individuals, we all live in a home, we all live in a community. And so that diversity, that inclusion, that sense of belonging begins at home. So not only am I responsible for, trying to address some of British Columbia's complex and challenging problems around housing affordability, making sure that we're keeping on track with delivering the government's commitment on delivering more affordable housing, but also I'm responsible for the inclusion and diversity. So some of the things that I'm doing in British Columbia right now is working on race-based data legislation so that we will have the ability to take a look at how inequality and inequities have taken place within our province, and will allow the government to take a look at their programs and services and to put in place mechanisms so that we can bring some of the BIPOC communities that you've mentioned up to an equal playing field. So really exciting times. I'm really enjoying having the ability to ensure that we are able to capture that data, because I think that it's going to be a game changer in terms of how we deliver social housing and community support programs in our province and right across the country.
Thank you, Angela. That's fantastic. Steph, how about you? What's the biggest challenge you see by a non-diverse organization, especially CMHC?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Before I answer the question,
Sure.
I do want to acknowledge, so I am an ally,
Yes.
and I feel really, as I know I'm a white, male, middle-aged, I know I have privilege.
Yep.
I just wanted to say that, and I'm really honored to be joining the panel today. So that was point number one I wanted to make sure I said. To pick up on what Angela was saying, as the National Housing Agency, a few years ago, we set ourselves a pretty aspirational goal that by 2030, everyone in Canada has a home that they can afford and that meets their needs. We are entrusted to deliver billions of dollars in housing support to Canadians. And frankly, if we don't have diverse leadership and a diverse population that represents the Canadians we are serving, how can we ever be expected to design the programs, the services, in the most effective way to deliver to those people most in need? So that's, I think, point number one. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I would say if we don't have that kind of diversity in our leadership, it just reinforces some of the systemic barriers and biases that are in all organizations, including CMHC. Mm-hmm. And I think, we're relatively early in our journey as an organization. I think the George Floyd murder was a call to action.
Yes.
I'm proud to say that the company has made some pretty bold commitments to anti-racism and equity. We're still on our journey of figuring out how to deliver on those commitments, but I think it's critical if we're going to deliver the most effective housing programs for Canadians.
Awesome. Tell me a little bit about Noble, because I appreciate your opening salvo around acknowledging the privilege, etc. But I do see you first and foremost as an ally. It's been a pleasure getting to know you over the last little while, and I know you've been a part of this organization's efforts for a long time. But when it comes to somebody like yourself in an executive capacity stepping up for the Black community, I think it actually speaks volumes. So tell us a little bit about Noble and your involvement in that and what that represents and what it's tried to accomplish as well.
Okay, so Noble stands for the Network of Black Leaders. And again, following the murder of George Floyd, we had a leadership call within the company. And there's a young woman, a Black woman, her name's Nellie. She asked if she could join that leadership call. We were talking about the events that were unfolding in the news. And she just wanted to listen in. At the end of that call, she said, "Can I have a couple minutes?" And she spoke up, and it's probably the single most impressive display of leadership that I have been personally witness to that I've in my entire life. She had 200 leaders in the palm of her hand speaking about what we need to do as an organization, the fact that during that time, nobody had checked in on her to see how she was doing. Mm-hmm. The emotion, the passion, it was I'll never forget it. After that event, I reached out to Nellie because I want to know this person. So we had a great conversation. A few months went by, and then a select group of black employees wanted to create an employee resource group. Nellie contacted me and said, "Would you mind being our executive sponsor?" At that stage of the game, of course, we had no black, indigenous, or people of color in our senior leadership team. That, I'm happy to say that's now changed, but at that time we didn't. And so I'm like, okay, I have to admit, I felt a little bit odd as the sort of the white guy. But I have to tell you that the journey in the last year has been life-changing. There's 5 leaders of the employee resource group. They have become friends for life. We are trying to raise awareness about, black culture, create a safe space in the organization for black employees to share stories, support each other. If there's mental health challenges, to sort of speak about that. And the team is now starting to take on a broader role and actually thinking about what can it do to influence, make better housing outcomes for black Canadians in this country. So it started as kind of a grassroots movement, and now it's emerged into there's 160 members, both black employees and allies, who are fully committed to trying to make housing outcomes for black Canadians better. And what's really gratifying to see is a number of other employee resource groups have now since started to emerge. We have an Indigenous Employee Circle, an Asian Employee Network. I just saw the other day there's a Pride Employee Resource Group that's being stood up. It's been phenomenal to see sort of the grassroots movement and employees taking hold of this.
Fantastic. No, it's, as you said, like even, again, I keep reflecting to this morning's keynote a little bit and how, when he spoke about human rights, and I think there's this core of everything you just said was about human rights and having your rights recognized and being heard. So again, I respect the work that Noble's doing. I challenge other organizations if they haven't started to do something along these lines, because you made an important point, and I can't wait at some point to meet Nellie. But you made an important point around how people feel, right? I think that resonates all the way up and down the spectrum, right? When you think about an event that happens and it's in the news and we're all reacting to it, it affects people of color differently. Similarly to what's been happening with residential schools in Canada, it affects people differently of the Indigenous community. And I think for you guys within your group to ensure that you're hearing people at that emotional level, you're getting an opportunity to now make a more impactful change from my perspective. And then hopefully it will turn into some of the bigger policy things, and I have that question coming up for you after. But that's where you want to get to, is how are people feeling and how they're going to react to these things, not just make up something and hope for the best. So, it's eyes wide open leadership, and I applaud you for it, so thank you. Barrington, same question, because you're in academia, and there's always been this correlation for me to 3 things: housing, education, and health, right? And I think about you and your role. It's a newer role within your university, the AVP of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion.
Yes.
When I hear that, it's a broad brush, but when I think about it, I think there's a start that would be in that same place we're all talking about, which is how do we affect and impact the lives of racialized students, probably in your case, or educate better on, the history of racialized people in Canada. So again, leadership within your space as well. Like, talk to it. Like, what's happening without the lack of that diverse leadership at the scholastic level? Because I think it all interplays here. So I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, what we're finding is folks who have, to speak to Angela's point about the importance of data, right? There are folks who have gone out and started to generate data on what our institutions of higher education look like, and at the highest levels of leadership. And this dovetails with what folks have been saying about the housing sector, is that the highest levels of leadership in higher education aren't representative of the broader society as a whole. And it behooves us as institutions of higher education that there is some representational diversity that mirrors, as best we can. It's going to be a slow process that mirrors Canadian workforce data. And when institutions call for they have campaigns that invoke things like human rights and social justice. And when people look around boardroom tables and leadership groups can't even live up to some of the rhetoric that they're espousing in terms of who's in that room, you quickly fall into a crisis of legitimacy. And I think that's a lot of what we're talking about here, is that institutions at the highest levels that aren't representative of the broader population are rapidly losing legitimacy. And as well, they suffer from, and I will invoke a deficit model in this particular context, from the things that my friends on the stage have said. There's a deficit in terms of skills, competencies, perspectives, lenses, and a real impoverishment around how we imagine the embodiment of leaders, where we find leaders, how we mentor leaders, how we cultivate those things. So representative leadership is key, and leadership that has EDI lenses, social justice lenses, and human rights lenses are absolutely key moving forward.
Fantastic. And I'd like to welcome to the stage my friend Mark Beckles. Please have a seat, join us for the conversation. I'm going to throw you immediately into the hot seat, my friend. So welcome.
Thank
How
you so
are you?
much. Thanks for having me.
And everybody in the world knows that we've blamed Toronto traffic, and I'm a Torontonian myself, and I understand the trials and tribulations. But welcome, take a breath, and I'm happy you're here. So Mark, we're asking the question about the impacts of not having a diverse leadership group within various sectors. You're here on stage representing what we call the private sector, right? What has that impact been in your organization? Now, I know you're somebody who is doing a lot with respect to community, social change at the institutional level from the bank. But what has that impact of not having that diverse leadership been on an organization like yours? And what are some of the things you're doing to make that switch?
Hot seat indeed. Thank you for having me. I assume the microphone is on.
You're good to go.
Wonderful. I would start by saying that, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, a lot of organizations and, more broadly, society talks about, the principles of diversity and inclusion for growth and innovation and really driving economies forward. And the great challenge then with that is that organizations, to the extent that they are diverse and inclusive, are actually driving growth and innovation forward. To the extent that they're not diverse and inclusive is the extent to which we are slowing innovation, is the extent to which we are slowing growth, is the extent to which we are leaving opportunity on the table, is the extent to which we are compromising competitiveness. And so that, diversity and inclusion, even if you don't do it because it's the right thing to do, which is, I think, the starting point for why we should embrace a strategy around diversity and inclusion, there are all kinds of other business and social and economic imperatives for why we need to be more inclusive in our approach. And this really then goes back to the whole notion of, diversity and inclusion to unlock the potential of people, to unlock the potential of organizations, to unlock the potential of society more broadly. In the context of Canada, we know that there has been and will continue to be a significant demographic shift. And if we think about Toronto more specifically, we know that a majority of residents of Toronto, just picking Toronto specifically, will identify as visible minorities. That is already, in fact, the case. That will continue. Well, unless we get to a place societally where we acknowledge that we've got this latent but sophisticated human capital that we have not yet tapped into, and that we can, as we tap into that capital, really begin to improve, the economic output of Canada across all sectors, and really show up more effectively as a G7 and therefore G7 partner, only to the extent that we can actually do some of these things and really embrace diversity and inclusion in all its forms, are we going to, I think, unlock the full potential of Canada's economic prosperity. We know that, sectorally, as we think about climate risk, we can't continue to fuel Canada's economic prosperity with a continued focus on the old ways of doing things, focusing on resources to drive our economic output. The real secret, therefore, then, is tied up in people, is locked up in people. And so to the extent that we can unlock that potential is in the extent to which we unlock Canada's economic potential and Canada's future.
Fantastic. Wow, that's why you needed you here. I was like, wow, that's an interesting perspective. So maybe I'm going to start in reverse order and we can all jump in at any time. I feel like some of us are chomping at the bit to respond and get in on stuff. But I'm going to ask question number 2. We're going to get into some more open discussion. But Steph, I'm looking at you. How do we overcome some of these issues? Because I agree with what Mark just said around people being the fuel. If anybody knows me, I think I've written it on every one of my profiles everywhere. I'm about people, process, technology, but it's people first, right? Here at this conference, all tomorrow is People Day. Today's Leadership Day. Who are people? So how do we fix it, and how do we overcome the issue of not having that diverse and inclusive culture within organizations, especially from leadership all the way down? What is your perspective on making those changes?
Well, like I said before, myself and our organization are relatively early in this journey.
Yep.
We have made some pretty bold commitments, and we, signed the Black North Initiative, for example. So making public, statements like that or commitments, I think creates a different level of urgency, and frankly accountability that I think is important. So I think just making those bold steps is a good starting point. I think conversation, I've seen a lot of conversation emerge in our organization over the last year that I think has been critically important. Where we're at now is turning that conversation into actual meaningful change. I think we're struggling with that a little bit, but I also think we need to be kind to ourselves because we are on a journey. I hear it's interesting. Noble, for example, is having an interesting dialogue now in the company about establishing a strategy specifically for housing for Black Canadians. And so that debate is happening, but there seems to be a lot of kind of what about isms that sort of creep up. And, what about the Asian community?
Yep.
Or what about this community? And we're struggling with this sort of concept of universality. So if you solve for one, particular group, a racialized community, for example, that inevitably in some way you're going to solve for others.
Right.
And so I think we need to sort of, it's easy to say, get over that, and just make the plunge and start actually trying to make change in a particular way. Yep. Turn the conversation into action, see what happens. That will provide feedback and learning, and then we can adjust and continue to move forward. There's a little bit of paralysis that I think can set in about sort of making the wrong move or stepping in the wrong place. And I think just as leaders, we need to make sure we are willing to take those steps and show the way for others to follow. And so that's where I think our organization is at. I think that's what I see happening. And this is where allyship starts to creep in and become critically important, and which I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark, I'm gonna flip it back to you on the overcoming piece, and I'm gonna keep coming around the horn, but since the seat's hot, I'm gonna keep it warm for you. I love those boots, by the way. It's phenomenal.
Thank you.
How do we overcome this? How do we make more change? Because again, representatively, when I look at the stuff we're speaking about, you are representative of a Black person in an executive role at an organization. How do we overcome that at large? How do we get more diversity within those leadership spheres?
I think part of the challenge that as we've begun to tackle the issue, and I say we, society more broadly, tackle the issue of diversity and inclusion, is that for too long we've tried to do to tackle the issue without an equity lens on the conversation, and as a result of that, I don't think we've taken enough stock around understanding, even within diverse communities, which communities perhaps need a bit more help than others. And equality is not the same thing as equity.
Yes.
We take an equitable approach in looking at the problem, but we need to take an equity approach to addressing the solution. And so when we look at how and where different populations participate in the Canadian economy, Canadian society, where they participate in large organizations, levels of seniority, and so on, it means that, corporate leaders, civic leaders, politicians, community leaders all need to have not just an active voice, but be active in coming up with strategies and being explicit and intentional around first identifying where individuals are missing and where they need to be, and understanding then what the barriers are. And then, shift the conversation from helping people to quote unquote overcome barriers to together removing barriers.
Yeah.
Right? And I think, part of it is getting the language right so that we get the strategy right. In the case of the organization that I am privileged to work for, and you talk about being at the table, I work for an organization where, I have the privilege of having a CEO who listens to me and listens to people like me.
Yeah.
And respects my perspective and takes action on what I say. And not just me, but, folk across the entire spectrum.
Yeah.
And when you have organizational leaders that spend enough time listening before they act, you actually drive to change. And when they then become leaders in their respective circles of influence and can demonstrate how they've driven change, others who respect them also drive change. And so I know it's a long answer to your question.
I like this.
But if organizations are to change, leaders need to listen and be open to change and to acknowledge where they've got opportunity. And again, not just talk about, well, we've got opportunity, actually doing something about it. And, I think Steffan talked earlier about the Black North Pledge, for example. That has spurred a lot of organizations into signing a pledge. Many of them still have to do something about it.
Yep.
Our organization did something about it.
Right.
And so we've seen significant changes in representation at the executive levels of our organization, even before the pledge came about.
Right.
But we've pushed ourselves to say we've got even more to do. And if our organization is to be reflective of the society that we serve, we're going to continue to push ourselves to make sure we are reflective.
I like that. It's a definite action. It's got to be an activity. It's got to take a little bit of guts. From what I've heard from both of your statements, is that, in my opening salvo, there was this DE&I is a big thing. It's a big ball, and in some instances, you got to narrow it down and focus on which part of the ball you want to bounce. And I think to your point, Steph, around not wanting the universalizing of it all. No, today we're going to focus on the Indigenous group, and we're going to try to get some of their issues and longstanding issues taken care of. And next, we're going to focus on Black people. And what's going to happen is that you're going to, from each of those building blocks, you're going to start seeing, you're probably going to have learnings from all of those. You're probably going to have synergies from all of those. And you're going to, like that rolling moss, it's going to just get better along the way. And by the time you get to everybody, you're going to have a really good product at the end of it also. I appreciate both, because I think the key there was a little bit of what they call it in wrestling when I was a kid, intestinal fortitude, guts. Barrington, how do we overcome this leadership, representative leadership piece from your perspective? I think I've heard some good things, but I want to hear from the rest of the group on it.
There's some really good points that have been raised. For me, hopefully this doesn't sound repetitive, but I think that somebody who's spent a lot of time in higher education, that education is key. Sometimes it's a bit of a cliche. I'm not fully convinced we can only educate ourselves out of the problems that we're in. There are some people who sort of willfully will ignore things that are presented to them. But generally, as a lifelong educator, I think that's key. And holding those kinds of meaningful conversations with people across institutions, and certainly leaders, is also key. I think data as well. I don't think we can tackle problems unless we know exactly what we're what we're talking about, and we don't know what we don't know. And I think that's tremendously important as well. I also think that some folks spoke about the accountability piece. There are some folks who are in leadership positions, but not quite the very top leadership positions, who need to exercise some courage in terms of, which sometimes can come at considerable personal and professional risk, but to push people who are our immediate superiors to do the right thing, to do the ethical thing, and do the just thing, even again if it means that maybe we take a step back or two in our own careers, which is tremendously difficult to do, and is that kind of work of advocacy that often doesn't get noticed by folks in the broader community. It's difficult to be a DEI champion in many of the organizations that we inhabit, and that's why allies are so tremendously important, particularly for BIPOC people that take on those sorts of advocacy roles within institutions. I also think as well that there's a role for people outside of institutions. You spoke of George Floyd and the Summer of Racial Reckoning. The speaker this morning, I'm sure, spoke about the discovery of Indigenous children in mass graves. Those kinds of mass movements, those kinds of appeals to people in positions of power, I think do have an effect on people who occupy some of the highest positions as well. So I think we need to be careful to also recognize that there's a role for all people in affecting change within institutions.
Phenomenal. And certainly not last or least or anything, just last in this question, but Angela, because I know you and we've been in these seats in this sector, for a little while. So what's your perspective on how we can overcome some of the barriers with respect to having more representative leadership within the sector?
Thank you for the question, Andrew. So I think some of the ways that we can overcome the barriers is essentially hiring more people that look like you and me at the most senior levels
Sure.
in housing organisations and in corporations across Canada. As you know, I've just recently started my new role, and a lot of people ask me why I wanted to take on this opportunity, notwithstanding the portfolio that I have, but I felt that I had to do something in terms of being a black woman in leadership, and I had to take that step forward and enter into this role so that other BIPOC employees could see that those opportunities are available to them. And I firmly believe in the philosophy of if you build it, they will come. I have heard from, a lot of BIPOC people right across the country that it's great to see that in British Columbia, whilst, they have their own things that they need to address in terms of addressing systemic racism and discrimination, they've acknowledged that there is change that needs to happen. And so for me, I think when we talk about overcoming, it's about those leaders really having an honest conversation with themselves around, the employees that they may have previously had in their organisation. Did they support them in the best way possible? Did they listen to them? Did they do the right thing? And obviously we can't go back, we can't change the past, but what we can do is change the future. And so I'm, asking all of the leaders right across the sector to look within themselves, look at their staffing at leadership levels. And when you are hiring for these new positions, whilst you may be putting out inclusive preference statements, it's about making sure that when those employees come into your organisations, you are making them as successful as possible within these roles. Because, we are here, we are willing to step up, we are willing to help and support our communities. And, we need to give them positive role models as well. And so that is our contribution to the overcoming.
Awesome. Wow. I'm going to take a pause there because that resonated with me a lot, Angela, with respect to the responsibility piece for the community. I think it's always incumbent of anybody, and I think it's any community, any race, any society, is that when you're in front of your people or you're around your people, you have a sense of responsibility that you feel when you're representing them. So like Mark, you're a VP at a bank. Steph, you're a VP at a mortgage company. Professor, an ADM. Like that matters. Like there's somebody within your community or within your smaller, your extended community that's looking at you that says, wow, I got a shot. And I think that's the bigger part of what I heard around this table is, let's take a little bit of risk. Let's have a little bit of guts, and let's make sure that we're putting that best foot forward. Not just for us, not just for tomorrow, for the longer tomorrow. Because I always think about this in those broader leaps for me personally. Like I think about when I'm going to be a grandfather, right? Hopefully, knock wood. But what will my grandkids say to me, and how stark will the world look to them in a different way? I'm hoping it'll be that way. I'm hoping there'll be none of these defined panels or issues around the need for these types of things ongoing, right? So I think everything that's been said up until now resonates, and I did have to take a pause on Angela's because I do agree that, just give people a shot. You'll be surprised as to what you're going to get out of some people, especially people from the BIPOC community. And more importantly, leaders, please make sure you're supporting everybody, but specifically those from those communities. There's an unsaid said in the at least in the black community, and I'll speak as a black man for a second, that you got to do everything 2 times. 2 times is hard. 2 times is anything, right? And I think what you're going to get is a lot of unsaid said sometimes from people of racialized groups within your organizations. So let's make sure that we're taking that extra time to cultivate and to develop and to support those folks, because what you're going to have inherently are people that are really wanting to do the best for you, because inherently they're doing the best in that weird way for them and their community, their families, etc. There's this weird ripple effect that there's pride in the work that they're going to be doing. And as I said, I'm speaking from a black man's perspective because I am. I'm not saying that this is unique to black people. I'm just speaking from the perspective and the skin and the seat that I'm sitting in. Okay, so we've been appealing to leaders for the better part of an hour right now on representative leadership and more diversity. What are some of the benefits? And I know, Mark, you kind of touched on that when you jumped in the hot seat. So maybe we'll open up the discussion to say, what are just some of the benefits of this representative leadership? And maybe I'll start on this one, because I think the biggest benefit on it is the end product, right? When I think about our end user and the people we support, it's our tenants. At the end of the day, there's no ONPHA, there's no community housing providers without tenants. And especially community housing providers, we're unique. And I brag about us all the time in our sector, because we're not just landlords. And I started off the top, and again, shout out to 1021 Burstmont Road, TCHC people out there, how you doing? But that community was more than the bricks and mortar for me, right? I didn't know I was raised in community housing until some kid on the bus in 5th grade told me I was from community housing. I'm like, I don't know what this is. And for me, it was a powerful place to live. It taught me how to draw. It taught me how to swim. It taught me how to, to build long-lasting life relationships with friends. So for me, those are the longer standing benefits, is that for some reason, the people that I interacted with, so I'm talking about that next level up employee, we usually call them the frontline staff, they're predominantly black when I was growing up, right? So for me, it was like, superintendent was that, the community, the guy who ran the gym or whatever, cool. It was always, and I always felt this sense of community, right? So for me, those are some of those longer standing benefits in my head. When I think about if somebody at the top of the table is looking at those core issues and saying, well, no. It's not really what that group might be thinking. How will we try here? Or how will we go and ask that group in a defined or specific way and get the answers? That voice at the table helps make those changes. So for me, there's a longer standing benefit to the tenants of community housing. To, in your point, and I think I actually spoke to it earlier before you got here, Mark, around the percentages. They're just realistic. Like Toronto, the city I live in, but in the province, it's a highly multicultural province. And if I look at the outset of what we're committing to as a government, so when I think about the next 5 years, we're bringing more people into this country. They got to have a place to live, right? There was a quote coming up from somebody that resonates with me that says, if I have a home, I have a place to start, right? So those are those positive outcomes. Because I do see, honestly, Steph, I look at you and I think about some of those challenges, right? Because, when I think about other cultural groups that are coming over as part of immigration, we're going to have to start looking at these as well. So I think the blueprint we're setting down with Indigenous, Black relations is super important for those successful outcomes. So that's my benefit. But I'll throw it out to y'all to get a sense of what those longer term benefits of diversity are from your perspective. Anybody can jump in on this one.
So I'll jump in. I'm not sure I'm going to answer that question directly.
Sure.
But I did want to talk a little bit about allyship and the benefits of that. And frankly, I think some of the struggles with allyship, we tend to toss the word around
Yes.
pretty easily, I think without really understanding what it truly means. And this idea of, giving power, sharing power, we as an organization are struggling with that right now. And, this aspect of white fragility and, getting over ourselves. And to your point, if you give people the power to make the change, create the difference, they won't let you down. They'll create the change. And I think we have to get better at empowering the people who can create the changes we're desiring. And frankly, white people, get out of the way, because that's how the change is going to happen. And so I really wanted to make sure that we sort of poked on allyship, because I think we toss the word around easily. We don't really know what it truly means.
Yep.
And yeah, that aspect of giving power, I think, is critical to success and change.
Agree. And I'm not going to ask you to move fully to the side, because I'll be dead honest too. It's a very difficult place to be in, always having to try to overcome. I think I love what Mark said earlier around, let's just remove the barrier. I don't want to get over the barrier. That's a lot of climbing. That's a lot of jumping. That's a lot of whatever. Just get it out of the way. And I think it's very important for allyship to happen, because I think folks like yourself and folks that are true allies that want to get out of the way a little bit and or hear the different perspective or what we're going to need, because at the end of the day, the construct of power is still in that way. So we're going to have those folks that are in leadership roles who are still predominantly non-Black or non-Indigenous or not a person of color, accept and listen to what we're saying in order for the change to happen. So I appreciate it. Not fully out of the way. Maybe over here a little bit, but not fully out the way.
Completely agree.
Always right there.
That's why these kinds of debates are so amazing, right? Because we have this kind of conversation. It's that's a learning moment for me, right? So
Yeah. We absolutely need you, absolutely, because again, too hard to overcome on our own. Mark, I feel like you want to jump in, so I'll let you get in there.
It's an interesting perspective. I'll come to Steph's comment in a second. I want to go back, Andrew, to your reference to community housing, and I think part of what we have to unlearn as a society is how we turn words like social housing or community housing into sort of pejorative terms, and confine people to a social construct because of where they where they were raised, where they lived, and so on. And we minimize people, I think, and minimize their potential sometimes because of this wrong-headed notion around community or social housing and the potential that they do or don't have because of a postal code. Mm-hmm. And I suppose I'm saying that to reinforce that we all, directly and indirectly have a responsibility in being more inclusive in the way we think and how we empower people and to help them see their place in society as something bigger than they even saw of themselves or that we see of them. We have to unlearn these social constructs that we assign to people on the basis of where they live. I was born in the UK, and we lived in what was called row housing, which today is very fashionably called townhouses. Mm-hmm. but it was, for all intents and purposes, in Manchester in the late 60s, it was social housing. Mm-hmm. Today, I'm a VP at a bank. Mm-hmm. You know, some may argue that, you know, I have broken through. Well, I've not really broken through. I just, you know, always had capability that through allyship, you know, I was able to arrive at where I am today and be on a panel with 4 other esteemed leaders. And so, to the point of allyship, then, to your point, I think part of it is that is understanding that allyship is as simple as what you said earlier, getting out of the way. To Andrew's point, not completely out of the way, but acknowledging that you are in the way. Right? And to me, that takes courage and that takes intentionality. And there is an implicitness attached to that makes allyship so real, so fresh, so game changing. And yet it's a little thing. You know, we're not talking about structures. We are just talking about getting out the way where it makes sense to get out of the way. Allyship is not about, you know, bold, convenient pronouncements when it's convenient for you. It is about everyday lived experience around how you are helping to make changes in the lives of other people. And those little changes add up. If I only ever see you in the news once a year and you're the biggest ally and you're saying all the right things, quite frankly, I'm concerned about the other 300 and some odd days in the year where you could have made a difference too. So I'll pause there for a second.
No problem. There you go. I like that.
Yeah.
Anybody want to jump in on that? Because I think for me, we're speaking about allyship, and that's leading to the broader, bigger outcome of, again, successful tendencies for me, right? I'll finish my original thought was just the sector is so resilient, diverse, and actually it's ahead of everybody actually when you think about it. Because when we're talking about some of the initiatives that are being brought to the forefront, community housing providers have been doing them for decades. Supportive housing, seniors housing, all these things. They've just been part of the vernacular of community housing, right? So I think, again, that more, let's be the forefront, let's be the forerunners on tackling the diversity piece, right? Because it's right in front of us. It's the easiest thing you can tackle because you have a tenant base that is looking for that support. So sorry, Angela, outcomes.
So I think when I think about the outcomes, you know, in the sector, I'm looking at the providers to look at their tenant populations, as you've rightly said, and to look at, you know, bringing up the next generation of employees and leaders. Obviously, you've got a base right there within your communities. When I think about one of my previous roles, you know, one of the things that I found really fulfilling is that as a racialized woman, that I was able to go into community and I was able to speak to the young people, to provide them with, you know, opportunities and to give them pathways to education and to be able to, you know, perform at a level where they would be able to generate an income, where they may be able to one day not have to live in community housing. So I think that as providers, that's the first thing that they can do. I think also when it comes to the question of diversity within your organisations, it's not just about the leaders, it's about the staff that are on the front lines. They have some really meaningful suggestions. They know how to address some of the problems that we're trying to tackle at the senior leadership level, and we should be going to them and asking for their advice and their input, because ultimately when we do the, you know, the staff surveys, or we ask them their opinions and their views, they are watching to see whether we are implementing them on the ground. And I think there's nothing more fulfilling for racialized employees who put forward good suggestions that are going to help and support people in community to see them actually play out in reality, because for them, they know that they're doing a job well done.
Absolutely. In Barrington, what's the benefit of these of making these leadership changes and the longer term impact on outcomes? Because, you know, I think you're somebody as an historian is also looking at what the future could hold, right? So, what do you think some of the outcomes could be?
No, absolutely. I think it's important to look back to get a sense of where we are, but also when we're thinking about what comes next, not to be trapped by the histories that we've lived through and histories that we're living through. And when I think about the benefits of diversity writ large, and the reason why I decided to get into this work and why I've spent so long thinking about these things is, again, looking back, this is a history where people's full humanity often hasn't been recognized by people in positions of power. And, you know, EDI work, diversity work, anti-oppression work, anti-racist work, when it's done intentionally and when it's done properly, really does address that, which is of broader societal benefit, right? We need to move towards a more inclusive, humane country where we just don't throw people's lives away. We don't throw people away, and where people are regarded, people are held up for being important. And also thinking about, when I think about my own background, my parents who are immigrants here from Jamaica, and slowly, and we've talked about this, sort of work themselves very hard, but work themselves up. And housing is an important part of that as well. And a country that doesn't have that place where communities can be anchored in the long run, to speak to some of the points that Mark raised, that is going to play out in future generations. That is going to have consequences for our country with diminished capability and capacity down the road as well. So housing is a critical piece of this, but the larger piece for me is, you know, I want to live in a country where people's humanity are fully recognized, and to me, that's a lot of what we've been talking about over the course of this conversation.
Phenomenal. Wow. I next time I'll bring a pen, and I want to take down all the notes. I'm hearing, you know, courage, risk, you know, allyship, you know, a variety of terms that are just, I think, the right things for all leaders to kind of write on their whiteboards. You know, I think, you know, sometimes it's always about strategy. Leaders always want to be strategic, and sometimes it's really just about having the courage to do something different. So I think it's a good start. So let me now get to the audience, because the audience has been doing iPad stuff here, and it's just like incredible. Technology is amazing. So I think we touched on some of this, but here's a question from the audience that I'll pose to the group. What do you think we can do as society from a policy-based perspective? Like what policies can we put in place to help with some of these changes? Like, I know we have pledges and so on and so forth, but are there other things that we can do to make better outcomes for racialized people across the leadership spectrum?
Maybe I can jump. Sorry, do you want to? You know, I think where we've got an opportunity is around education reform. I think that the way we teach within the context of our school system, in that context, we don't do enough to orient students to the importance of diversity and inclusion. We don't teach the richness of Canadian history in all its forms to Canadian students, and as a result of that, people come through school, through post-secondary education, into the workforce with a very narrow frame of what Canadian society is and their role in it. And as a result of that, I think that we find ourselves trying to remediate a situation on an ongoing basis Whereas if we could actually begin to think about how do we effectively incorporate history and really, change our approach to teaching social studies and those kinds of things, and really through illustrative models teach what diversity and inclusion looks like at a much younger age. Then we accelerate the opportunity toward really forging great human experiences and nurturing human capital, unlocking the potential of people within the construct of a truly inclusive and just society. And one of the great challenges that we continue to have, therefore, is because our education system is administered at the provincial level. There is no national education strategy, and therefore no national construct around how we teach and embed and honor. We'll teach and embed history and honor, the history of Canada's original peoples. I think we miss a huge opportunity, a significant opportunity, to address in the most fundamental of ways how we can actually, create a society where it is truly North, strong, and free, and truly a place where we all see ourselves in it. So I think we need to consider the role of education in addressing this challenge.
Okay. No, preaching to the choir here. It's my second pillar after housing is education. So I hear you on that. Any other perspectives on the question? Angela, I know you wanted to speak to it.
So just to continue on from your point, Mark, around education, I firmly believe that in community housing and in the social housing sector, that there should be a policy change where all providers are actually looking at bringing in anti-racism training and actually competency frameworks around being able to work and to understand racialized groups, because given the diversity of the populations that you're working with, it's absolutely critical and essential and key that when you have your employees out there representing you and your organisation, that those employees are able to represent you in the best way, but also to support the tenants in the most culturally appropriate way possible. So that's the first thing. I also think when we take a look at our recruitment and our retention policies, as a matter of fact, we should automatically have preference statements on all of the jobs that go out in our sector, so that people know that this is an inclusive sector and we do want to hear from people from all diverse perspectives. And also there should be policy changes in taking a look at how we retain people as well, and making sure that there are, as you have alluded to, Steffan, employee support groups and opportunities for racialised people to be able to feel like they are included and belong. And later on this week, you are going to hear from somebody who posted a tweet that said that, diversity is a fact and inclusion is a choice. And I challenge you all to say that you now have the choice within your organisations to make this change so that we are representing all of the diverse groups that we house on a daily basis, and make sure that we can improve the outcomes of their lives.
Well said. Anybody want to chime in on that question? I have another question from the audience. It's more around the on the inside. So the attraction part, I think we've spoken to that at length. It's what can we do at a greater level to support racialized employees, and that's coming from the audience. Is how do we retain the talent? Because I think there's a notion where a lot of providers, leaders, et cetera, could come around and say, well, man, we hired Tony, and now Tony's no longer here. why did Tony leave faster than everybody else, or why are they not no longer here? So it's just around that whole retention piece. How do we support racialized employees? Because I think I don't want to leave it as just a leadership thing and just putting people in roles. I think that's a tough position to be in for anybody who gets a job just because, right? So how do we support racialized employees, especially from the BIPOC community, so that they feel like they're part of an organization that they can grow? Now I know you had a great example with Noble, Steph, but I mean, are there other ways or other things that organizations are doing to support and make their work environment and their work livelihoods better?
Yeah, I think there's some really, frankly, some basic things that can be done. So we're fortunate at CMHC, we have a pretty robust benefits package, and we have created very specific channels for mental health support for
Excellent.
employees of racialized groups, for example. They have very dedicated individuals that they can speak to if they're particularly challenged or suffering through something. So they have those kinds of avenues to them. To Angela's point, we're in the process of reviewing sort of our HR policies for recruitment and retention. We've set very specific targets at different levels for diversifying our population with time. Yeah, those are the kinds of things that I think just need to start working on. And yeah, and then I think the previous question around policy. There are tools out there that you can use. I think we need to start with making sure the policies we do have in place, whether they are broad sort of macroeconomic policies or housing policies or internal policies, that how those were originated, the biases and systemic sort of barriers that exist in those, let's first assess those.
Yes.
Get rid of those. So there's tools like GBA Plus. We've developed an anti-racism and equity tool that you can use to sort of go through a methodology to make sure you are at least conscious of that, looking for it, and purposely trying to avoid those kinds of barriers to the extent possible. And I think those are kind of some of the things that we just need to get action-oriented on and do. Yeah.
Sometimes it's just as simple as that, just doing something. Do you want to chime in on that, Barrington?
Yeah, sure. For me, with the policy piece, again, in the previous question, one of the things, take a slightly different direction than some of my peers here. I often think in terms of historic patterns of inequality with regard to wealth. And that is an uncomfortable conversation for many Canadians. But I really do feel that these inequities that we see, somebody mentioned earlier in the panel that there are some groups, I believe it was Mark, that haven't done as well as others. And sometimes this kind of, the broad kind of multiculturalizing diversity discourse sometimes obscures that. And there are historically specific reasons why that is the case. So I do think that governments need to more seriously look at the question of intergenerational wealth gaps. I'm a big believer in education, of course, as an educator. I'm a big believer in diversity training as somebody who touts that where I work, but I also know that there are these longer structural forces at play. With regard to recruitment and retention, I agree with much of what's been set up here. One of the approaches that's been taken in higher education, I'd be interested to see what my peers think about this, is cohort hiring. So rather than have one employee at a senior level or a mid-managerial level become the sort of agent of change by virtue of them embodying whatever social position, you hire people as part of a group that can support each other. And have community amongst each other, and I think you're more likely to have people stick around if they see that they're part of a larger group. I think that's something to think about. I also think we need to think about shifts in organizational culture before we think about bringing people in. So what's the work that we've done with senior management to make sure that the soil is tilled, right, for these people that we're going to bring in? And what are we doing in terms of accountability with senior leadership as well? What is the implication for somebody who's a CIO or a CEO or a VP if we look at the data in 5 years and the racialized folks that we've hired have all departed for other places? Is that going to cost somebody their job? And I believe that that it should, and that's part of changing organizational culture and part of accountability. So I'm not somebody who likes the idea of bringing in one tokenistic hire to do the work of culture change. It doesn't work.
Absolutely, it's a recipe for disaster. And to your point earlier, Mark, around the pledger, right? You can pledge, but you got to do something, right? So I think the pledge is always the first part of the action, and I appreciate both perspectives, because I think both organizations, both Steff's and Mark's, have taken the Black North Pledge, for example, and being very cognizant of the fact that you have to start doing something. So Steff, you're at the starting of the journey. Mark, you guys are probably somewhere in the middle or starting of the journey as well, but it's the action part, right? And that's where what you're saying, Barrington, is, what's the accountability to the action or the inaction of leaders to make these changes happen. So I think it's a very important point. Did you want to make a statement, Angela?
Yeah, just to say that, there are other things that organisations can do. Certainly when I take a look at the work that we're doing out in British Columbia, to diversify our workforce and ensure that we retain those employees. We are working now with BPOC employee recruiters now to make sure that we are getting the best talent out there. But it's not just about obviously working with those recruiters. It's about doing the work with the managers that these employees are going to be working for. And just as you are starting to onboard the new employees, the leaders as well need to have a better understanding of the staff member that's going to be joining their team, understand their lived experience and their perspective. And one of the reasons why I've asked for that to be introduced is recognising that people from racialized backgrounds are different. We do have different perspectives and things, and it may not necessarily align with the corporate culture or the missions, visions and values of an organisation, but that doesn't mean to say that they can't be positive contributors to your organisation.
Agreed wholeheartedly.
Andrew?
Yes.
Can I just pick up on a comment that
Absolutely,
Barrington
yes,
made? So
absolutely.
I love the comment about wealth generation, wealth disparity. From a broader economic point of view, as a housing agency, right, we talk about supply and demand,
Yeah.
and how the imbalance in that can affect housing affordability.
Yep.
And so we're very conscious of, if you make access to home ownership easier and supply doesn't follow,
Yep.
pure economic argument is prices will go up with
Yep.
time because demand exceeds supply. However, I think we have a responsibility to think about how we can purposefully and smartly enable access to home ownership for the wealth reasons you talked about, for particular groups that may have been disadvantaged in that space in the past.
Yes.
Because that feeds into education and small business, and there's all sorts of other economic spin-offs that come from that. It's just this entire cycle. And so, yeah, our organization, for example, while I think we need to be conscious of supply and demand, I do think we can do things smartly that address some of the concerns you raised. And again, that just takes courage, I think, to make sure we do that in a smart but meaningful way.
Absolutely.
Can I follow up
Absolutely.
quickly on that?
Yep,
I mean,
please.
we're about to, as you know, everybody in this group knows, we're about to enter into one of the greatest intergenerational wealth transfers of all time. And I believe it's the millennials that are going to be the greatest beneficiaries, and a few people in my generation, Gen Xers. And this story is often told just like we tell the story of, the post-war boom and suburbanization, but we don't like to talk about who's going to be left out of that transfer. And I really do worry about those historic patterns of wealth disparity being calcified at this particular moment, because it's not everybody who can get an early inheritance to run and go buy a house in Rosedale, right? And this is what we're encountering. So I think the work that folks like you can do in institutions to try and address those sort of baked in inequities in wealth is key.
And if we agree that, historically the greatest source, or at least the foundational source of intergenerational wealth transfer is and has been home ownership, certainly in the last 100 years. And to Barrington's point, you look at the gap that exists for people of color and particularly members of the Black community in particular, mathematically, you know that the next generation of Black youth are starting at a deficit.
Yep.
And unless and until we can actually think about how we remediate that issue by ensuring that we can actually now make access to capital easier by removing criteria and rules and guidelines that have been historically prejudicial and without basis other than race, we are going to make worse a situation that already exists. And we saw the situation in full display, or on full display, over the last, I would say, 2 years in particular through COVID-19.
Yep.
COVID-19 highlighted in very stark terms the social equity gap that exists across a number of dimensions, not the least of which is access to home ownership, or at least even being able to enter the housing market, or to
Absolutely.
keep the home that you are in, whether it is you are a tenant or you own it. And that is nothing of access to capital to start a small business or anything of the sort. And when you unpack all of this, you begin to see that historically there have been criteria that have been designed to perpetuate inequity as opposed to enable equity and fairness. And so I think on a number of fronts, there is opportunity to really begin to tackle this in a robust way.
Yep.
The last thing I suppose I want to jump on really quickly is this whole notion of employees and what organizations can do to create, I think, exceptional employee experiences. First and foremost, people that work in organizations want to see people that look like them, right? And regardless of who you are, you want to see people that look like you. You want to have meaningful experiences with people that look like you. You want to be part of an organization who shares your values. And then beyond that, there are opportunities for organizations themselves to create those meaningful interactions between employees, whether through access to mentorship, training, networking, career development, those kinds of things. And those can be sort of broad-based, or they can be culturally specific or specific to certain diverse groups. But the extent to which employees play a role in that, in making it happen, facilitated by the organizations for which they work, and where there's active investment, and I would say active inclusion for employees, is the extent to which it works.
Phenomenal. So, time flies when you're having fun. We're coming close to the end of our panel, which I don't want to end. So, for everybody out there, this is going to end, and then we're going to keep on with our own little panel going up in the other room. But I'll actually answer one question that came in, because I think Steph answered it earlier. Is how do white allies, as white allies, what advice can you give us on stepping back and offering opportunities for BIPOC employees? I think it was that kind of get out of the way bit, and I think you were also saying in that get out of the way bit, listen. And I think you got to really open your ears as an ally to understand what the issues are, so that you can now advocate and support. So I'm paraphrasing, but I'm answering, because I do want to ask this one question in the short time we have left. Is what role can the board of directors play in making this a reality from a change perspective? Angela?
So I think one of the roles that the board of directors can play is that they can hold the leaders of these organisations accountable. Ultimately, they are the people who assess and evaluate the performance of the leaders, and it should become part of the competency conversations that they're having with their employees. They need to be asking the question, tell me about your diversity and inclusion strategy. Tell me about your retention strategy. Talk to me about your strategy of how you're making your tenant communities as inclusive as possible, and what are your plans around collecting data so that we're able to tell a better story and to address some of the issues that we know to antidotally be a problem within the tenant populations that we serve. So I absolutely think that as directors on the board, that they can show leadership themselves and start to ensure that they're holding these leaders accountable and requiring them to make the changes that are needed in the sector.
I mean, I feel this is a question I should defer to my colleagues, but I will quickly say that that one of the most important places where social change is affected is in the composition of boards and board governance, right? So almost every organization that I know of that sort of touts, equity, diversity, and inclusion, again, a lot of times boards aren't reflective of the greater population, and they have all sorts of deficits around competency. So board governance is key. It signals to the entire organization that organizations aren't just spouting words, but are willing to back it up in terms of deeds.
Yeah, I agree. There's been quite a great deal of progress at the board level with respect to gender balance. Yes. I think the next is greater racial balance and participating in, holding themselves accountable to be part of the same conversations and exercises that the companies they govern are going through, right? So we have a number of training programs. Our board goes through those things as well. They spend time talking about these issues. So I think there's sort of a accountability there that's important as well. And again, the more diverse the board is, the more it's going to reflect sort of the decisions and things that need to happen in the organization for greater change. So
you often hear on Bay Street organizations say, well, we don't know where the talent is. We don't know, and many of them are looking for the unicorn.
Yeah.
Quite frankly, one doesn't have to look far. If you really want to find diverse senior level talent, whether at the governance level or at the senior executive level, it's all around you. You just have to open your eyes, and thank God I work for an organization where our leader has done that. I just want to touch on the theme of allyship, and just to remind us all that allyship is a two-way street. I need to be as much Steph's ally as he is mine, because he doesn't know what he doesn't know, and I don't know what I don't know. Yeah. We are on a journey of learning together. And allyship works best when there's an acknowledgement that it is a journey of learning with a sense of urgency and goals attached thereto. But allyship is not a one-man band or a one-person band. We are all in it together.
Fantastic. And on that note, I'm gonna end the panel and thank each and every one of you. This has been something that for me has been fulfilling because I think it's a conversation that has gone unsaid for some time within the sector. And I'm going to encourage leaders out there to remain courageous, to remain risk-focused, to remain listening. Variety of the terms that we heard today all resonate with leaders. And again, I just want to thank everybody for spending the time, especially my esteemed panel and friends. And I hope the rest of you all have a great afternoon. So thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and to our panelists for sharing your knowledge with us today. There are definitely a lot of great takeaways from this discussion. To provide your feedback, please complete the survey at the bottom of your screen. If you still have questions that we didn't get to during the plenary, you can reach out to us by clicking Member Support under the main menu. We're now going to take a break to recharge. After the break, we'll start our next round of sessions at 1:50 p.m. Please go to My Events and Meetings and click on your session to join. See you back in your sessions at 1:50.